to the 146th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Grossman. My friends call me Jag. I'm the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways, animated videos, graphic novels, also leveraging cutting-edge technology like artificial intelligence. Today, we are joined by Gabrielle Bauer. Before I even begin to introduce our guest, I want to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, go ahead, get started. Use that comment section to type in your questions, and we will get to as many of them as we can. Gabrielle Bauer is author of Blindsight is 2020, Reflections on COVID Policies from Dissident Scientists, Philosophers, Artists, and more. As you can see, mine is already well worn with all of these bookmarks. It is a new publication from our friends at the Brownstone Institute. It profiles dozens of thinkers bringing fresh and diverse perspectives on the ethical breaches and social upheaval resulting from COVID-19 policies. Bauer's health journalism has also won several national awards. Gabrielle, thank you for joining us.
No, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
So in your book, you share stories from people, various walks of life, scientists, filmmakers, executives, quote, who shared the conviction that the world had lost its mind, end quote. But you also share your story. So perhaps you'll share a bit of that with us. What is the path that took you from nearly getting trapped in Brazil's lockdowns to writing this book?
Well, you got 3 hours? No, I'll try to make it short. I was in Brazil when this all started. I was visiting friends. That's a whole story in itself. I had lived in Brazil for 5 months, 2 years earlier, and made some wonderful friends. And I was down visiting them, and then the city where I was locked down, and the Prime Minister of Canada, where I live, said, all Canadians need to come home. I resisted it for a while because I had just got there and really wanted to see my friends, but it soon became clear that I wasn't going to be able to see anyone because everything was locked down, and some of my friends were afraid. And so I went to Sao Paulo and waited, 48 hours for the first plane that I could get on, and then finally made it back to Toronto. And when I got home, my husband literally greeted me with his hand outstretched, like, stop, stay 6 feet away. And so I quarantined for 14 days.
In the basement?
In the basement, when I had a lot of time, I had my computer so I could really think about what was going on. And from the very, very first day this all happened, it did not sit right with me. I am 66 years old. I was 63 when it happened. So presumably in an age bracket that would want the protection from all these measures, but it didn't sit right with me in a very, profound way. And I needed to explore that. I mean, I tried. I gave it a good college try. I describe in the book how I put a banner under my Facebook picture, stay home, save lives, but it did not feel authentic. And a few hours later, it came down. And, I reflected deeply on all this. It took me a while to really acquire the vocabulary to understand what was troubling me about all this and about this whole new COVID culture that was springing up, characterized, by shaming and snitching and fear. It all seemed disproportionate and wrong, and somehow that it was missing something vital. And, one thing led to another. I ended up forming a group in Toronto of people who shared my sentiments. We called ourselves QLIT, Questioning Lockdowns in Toronto. And we became very, very active on WhatsApp. Our WhatsApp chat never slept. We organized meetups as well, and we were a great support to each other. at a time when the whole world seemed just collectively to have taken a single, path, and when any objections would get shut down and shamed.
I remember that time well. And you also found your tribe. And in speaking with these other voices seemed to also help to find your own. So at the beginning of your book, you have a chapter called A Tale of Two Stories. And there was one dominant story that you said, you tried to buy into, but it didn't quite feel right for you. But tell us about those two stories. What are they? What are the differences between how they traveled, who they appealed to, and what the implications were of the very disparate way that those two stories were treated?
So I've heard these stories described as the thesis and the antithesis. So the thesis was the dominant story, and it was a bit of a war story. The thesis postulated that COVID was this extinction level enemy, an enemy of the people, and we had to marshal all our forces and resources to defeat this enemy, whatever it took, whatever sacrifices it took, whatever privations it took, we just had to do it. There's no other way. Everything else could wait, or, living, cultural activities, any kind of social activities, communion, religion, whatever. It could all wait. We just had to do this. And then under that story, this counter narrative started to build up, slowly at first, and we weren't allowed to talk about it. And, we had to kind of feel around to find like-minded people. And this counter narrative was more of what I call an ecological story. There's this virus that has entered our ecosystem, seems to be uncommonly contagious. From what we can see so far, it doesn't look like eradicating it is a realistic or worthwhile endeavor because it carries too high a cost. So we somehow have to find a way to coexist with it, without ruining everything that gives our lives texture and meaning and brilliance and all those things. So that's how I describe the two stories.
And you also described two groups that gravitated towards one story or the other, a team A and a team B.
Yes.
Team B is sometimes described as team reality. Of course, I'm sure team A thinks that they were team reality, but
yes,
I know. Describe them?
Justin Hart, who you may know, describes team A as team apocalypse and team B as team reality. But as you say, each team thinks that they're on the reality side. So which kind of people did joined each team? I was actually very surprised initially at all the people who joined team A, kind of reflexively. I had not believed that my own ideas about life and freedom and the balance between safety and freedom and all these things, I had not believed that my ideas were extraordinary in the slightest. I thought I was just average in that regard. And so it was a real shock to me to see just about everyone I knew just leap to team A, and that was it. So I really thought a lot and a long time and deeply about all this, and it's hard to come up with a list of characteristics, but I think that there is something in modern society that I call the biomedical view of living that is very dominant, and that is, that we are entitled to a certain level of physical health and protection, and it's the government's job to do that. And it's the government's job to prioritize that over all other considerations. So I think a lot of people subscribe to that ideology because it has become dominant in today's society because we have the technological tools or more of them to make it somewhat possible. And so there's this focus on what I call metabolic health, keeping metabolic health going, has become very prevalent. And those are the people who subscribe to that model, went to Team A. And then there's this initially ragtag and then more organized group of dissidents who have perhaps what I call a more holistic view of life and living, who recoiled against the Team A model and found another team.
So I'm going to pause. I'm going to remind all of you that are watching us on different platforms to just go ahead and dive in. I also want to encourage you to check out Gabrielle's book, Blindsight is 2020. It was real fun for me because a lot of the people that you profiled are people that I've been following or people that I've interviewed myself, and to dive in a little bit more to their backstory was a real treat. So in looking at those people that you profiled, including many with insights into psychology, you talked about them having a kind of a more holistic view, less myopic view, taking into account trade-offs. But were there other factors that determined, how these people ended up, taking that skeptical view and ending up in this book? Were there factors of temperament, ideology? A lot of times this was just cast in terms of ideology, and I think that there was an aspect of that for sure. Actual risk profile, people that were at higher risk tended to be the ones who were more apocalyptical about it.
Although many young people were too, which surprised me.
That's true.
Yeah,
in fact, when I see a lot of the people that are still walking around with masks, they are at negligible risk and probably harming themselves with keeping their immune system so naive and not interacting with the kind of normal bugs and germs that you encounter in real life. So
yeah, it reflects a certain worldview. So going back to your question, how did these people make their way into the book? There's various factors. I wanted to have a balance of disciplines for one thing, because again, part of the dominant narrative has been we have to listen to the scientists, as though only scientists have worthwhile things to say about how to manage a pandemic. That is one of the chief themes in the book, that no, this is absolutely not true. The scientists know more than others about, virology or patterns of transmission, but they do not know more or have more authority than anyone else in steering humans through a pandemic, because there are many aspects that go beyond the science of a virus. There are aspects of mental health, spiritual health, how to balance economic health, how to balance costs and benefits. And scientists scientists may be at a disadvantage in evaluating these other facets because they are trained to look for one nail and they have their one hammer. So I felt it was very important to really go beyond featuring just scientists. So I definitely do feature some scientists and doctors because, they did have some of the dissident scientists accomplished important things, but I also feature novelists and other artists, philosophers, ethicists, very, very important, and even a comedian and a priest, So, and then the other thing is I featured people who really held my hand in a way throughout this journey, people that I discovered along the way, online or in person, and who really helped sustain me. So I know a couple of people have said, well, how come I'm not in the book? And, it's a fair criticism, but you can't include everyone because there are so many bright lights in side B. And there's no way I can include them all, and I make no claim to including the most important one. I wanted to balance, as I said, disciplines and also political perspectives to help, counter that perception that it's just alt-right, whatever, supporters who would oppose any of this stuff. It's not at all the case. So that was part of my objective.
The selection process. So some of the people you profile are relatively well-known: Jay Bhattacharya, Vinay Prasad, Glenn Greenwald, Jennifer Say, Anders Tegnell, who is the chief epidemiologist, chief health officer in Sweden. But others were fairly new to me, which was surprising because I thought I followed this space pretty obsessively. If you were to choose one of those two lesser known names, tell us who they were and what their stories have to offer in terms of a better understanding of the past 3 years.
Well, there's a couple of writers that come to mind. I find that of all the people, all the COVID commentators that I know, I find the writers have arguably been the most insightful. Well, and they also know how to express those insights because they are writers. One of them is Lionel Shriver, who's actually a woman. She's the author of the very well-known We Need to Talk About Kevin. And she was a very salty, acerbic skeptic from the start. And I really identified with the way she just recoiled against this wholesale assault on personal freedom and completely unquestioned, and the minutiae that we entrusted to governments to handle, how far we could stay from people, how many people we could have in our bubble, where we could stand, where we could sit, where we could breathe, the most whether and how we could have sex. I mean, there was no end to it. And it's astonishing when you think about that a large swath of society just accepted that. And then another writer who is in the same chapter as the one in which I feature her, Matthew Crawford. He's a very interesting fellow because he's a writer, he's a philosopher, and also a mechanic. So, and he loves the open road, comes alive on the open road. So he has a visceral understanding of what freedom means. And he talks about how pro-social inclinations, humans sort of naturally wanting to help each other, don't come about in a climate of coercion. They just don't. So this idea of top-down collectivism just doesn't work, or it may work for a time, and then it stops working because everyone's different. And to expect everyone to be all in it together when you're dictating their every move, which was kind of the model that the governments used, doesn't really bring out the best in people. And, we've seen it happen. It just divided people, and ultimately was not sustainable.
Interesting.
Because not everyone's the same, and not everyone wants the same things and has the same priorities. So you have to inject some individuality into your recommendations.
So you talked about wanting to bring political balance to in part counter this narrative that anybody who questioned lockdowns or looked at the science of actual gradations of risk according to age, maybe we shouldn't treat 5-year-olds like 95-year-olds, that they were all lumped together. They're QAnon conspiracists, they're racists. That one still strikes me as how that,
Yeah. Not wearing a mask is racist. I know. I'm still trying to figure that one out.
But so many of those that you profiled were in fact fairly liberal Democrats, as we'd say here in the United States. And they questioned the party line on things like lockdowns and masks, and they found themselves on the receiving end of ridicule, ostracism, even death wishes. Were there any commonalities among lockdown and mask mandate skeptics on the left, whether a concern with free speech or the disproportionate negative impact of these policies on the poor, or just an intolerance of hypocrisy?
I would say all of the above. And in fact, the parameters that you describe, different people focused more on one or the other. Like Matt Taibbi, for instance, the journalist, he came out as an ardent defender of free speech. And so that was his focus. Glenn Greenwald, the hypocrisy, is what really rankled him. He had already written a book about hypocrisy in US politics a dozen years before the pandemic. And what was the third thing you mentioned?
And the disparate impact on the
poor. Oh, yeah, that's right. Well, there's a very left-leaning doctor, a Canadian doctor in Toronto called Stéphane Barral, and he ministers to the poor. He helps them and treats them, and so that was his primary area of concern. Another one, a British psychiatrist who is also in the book, he treats people with serious mental health problems, and they simply do not have the resources to behave in the ways that the governments wanted them to behave. So that was his, soapbox. But again, it comes down to the idea that we cannot treat all people as though they were the same, they don't have the same circumstances, resources, capabilities, or needs, and treating them all in an identical, or having the same expectations of everyone is cruel and not sustainable.
All right, I'm going to dip into some of the questions that are coming across the transom Facebook. Alex Marina, good to see you again, my friend. He says, Gabrielle, you mentioned you almost couldn't get back into Canada. Did you know anyone who did get stranded overseas from their homes?
No, I read about some people, but I didn't actually know about them. But it was certainly a harrowing 48 hours at the airport. We were all waiting for the next flight, and the airport was just a complete zoo. And it was interesting because part of me just wanted to go right back. I had a friend in Florianopolis, the Brazilian city where I was, who's very alternative, and she offered to put me up for a month, with all her cats and dogs and geese and rabbits and whatever. It was very tempting, just to escape the whole thing and stay there. But, I did have my husband. I didn't want to leave him on his own. And so I came back.
Speaking of which, was there any tension? You describe how, when you first came home and he said to the basement, because I think that has been very difficult for families and for some couples when they had a different view of what was going on and the policies.
Well, to my husband's great credit, he is the last person ever to shame anyone. He just doesn't do that. So although he was initially much more cautious and much more afraid than I was never afraid. As I say, despite my age, I was never afraid. I don't think I was in denial. On the contrary, I was quite obsessed with the whole thing and read the data and the studies and the stats, but I was not afraid. He would wipe down his groceries, but he never shamed me. And then the interesting thing is, I guess maybe some of my attitude rubbed off on him, because now he's really sick of masks. He's retired, and he is active in community theater, and he is royally fed up with the mask requirements within community theater, because he thinks it really interferes with rehearsals, with connection that happens with the whole magic of live theater.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
All right. Here's a different kind of question from George Alexopoulos on Twitter. He's asking, Gabrielle, looking back at your study of the medical field, your work as a medical journalist, would you agree that the medical complex focuses more on disease mitigation rather than prevention?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would go even further. That it focuses on the physiological aspects of health. So the WHO has defined health as a total state of being that encompasses mental and social and spiritual health. But the medical profession has forgotten that, and they completely forgot it or ignored it during COVID. And if you dared bring it up, yeah, you were accused of being a granny killer.
All right. My Modern Gaul, our friend on Instagram, asks, he's saying in some states here in the United States, at least, things have basically reverted back to pre-COVID, no masks, no social distancing. But this is not true for all states. He wants to know what the situation is like in Canada.
I think it's fairly similar now in Canada. Finally, it took a lot longer, certainly in the province of Ontario, for things to normalize. But I would say we're in pretty good shape now. The only place where you still encounter a lot of resistance, I find, is online. If you step into certain communities, you will find the people in them advocating for masks forever and really for a new social paradigm in which the world is treated like an infection control zone with all these checkpoints, and that's what some people wanted. And I think that's what led to a lot of despair in me and in a lot of people, with my concerns, that there was a certain group of people that just wanted to revolutionize society in this way, not in what I consider a good way, but really just to make the whole world into a hospital.
All right. Candice Morena on Facebook, out of all the pushback made against your writing or anti-lockdown efforts in general, what do you think was the most surprising?
Well, I guess the intensity of the reaction I got online initially in the first few weeks, when nobody in my real world circle was on the same wavelength as me. I tried to find connections online.
Pretty lonely.
Yeah, and the things that I was called. I mean, I had lived 63 years. No one had ever called me, a sociopath or, retard or negative IQ or a mouth-breathing Trump tart and all these things. It was just shocking. I could not believe the degree of vitriol. There was definitely a social phenomenon going on beyond the pandemic. And in one of the chapters I talk about that, there's this Matthias Desmet, a psychology professor in Belgium, who has called this whole phenomenon mass formation, which is really a fancy word for just groupthink and group psychology. And that was so strong in the beginning. And we really saw it in action.
Yeah, and I want to get a little bit more into that as well. I'm going to ask our friends online to pause for a second because I have a few more questions that I wanted to get to. I guess I would say to Candice that the thing that surprised me the most in the United States was just, well, certainly was pretty surprising and shocking to me and our friend Jeffrey Tucker to see groups that were supposedly committed to individualism and constitutional government and freedom and to critical thinking about trade-offs, to see so many libertarian groups that just like you, they put up that stay safe to stay home, and they kept it up a lot longer than you did. And really, I think there hasn't been an accounting for that. And also the surprise of just, I think we all have our stereotypes. I mean, we certainly have we have stereotypes of Canadians and Canadian nice, and we have stereotypes of Australians, being kind of rugged individualists. And so surprising, and maybe it was probably more of the stereotype that got wrong. But here in the United States, yeah, we do tend to value our freedom more. And so to see just how readily, without a peep, with very few exceptions, people bought into this, went along, and that to me was the biggest surprise of all, and the biggest disappointment.
I guess, as they say, fear is a powerful drug, right? So.
Yeah. I guess, or the desire to conform, but you
Yeah,
know,
that too.
and to give people the benefit of the doubt. I mean, if you're getting a steady drumbeat of fear, fear, fear from the media, you know, from public health officials, it's, you know, perhaps understandable that many people just completely bought into that unquestioningly. So, and along those lines, in the past couple of years, we've repeatedly heard the phrase, quote, out of an abundance of caution to justify school closures or travel bans. What is wrong with the using the precautionary principle as a guide to public health policy?
That is a great question, you know, and the subject of one chapter as well. I mean, the precautionary principle is really acting on the basis of a worst case scenario. So that makes sense on a very short-term basis when you really, you know, when the consequences of ignoring that worst case scenario are very grave. And so I'm talking, you know, weeks. But it's just not a life-affirming way to behave, because if you act on the basis of a worst case scenario for a long period of time, you're essentially restricting yourself from any activity that poses a risk. And so you're really curtailing your life and, you know, the enjoyment, the happiness, the meaning of your life. So it doesn't make sense to have long-term policies that use an unlikely worst case scenario as a basis, because you're completely hamstrung. You can't do anything. So as I say, it makes sense for a very, I mean, it's supposed to be invoked as a very limited, time-limited principle. And then you move on to something else. Then you move on to a proportionality principle where you weigh costs and benefits, where you listen to experts from various disciplines.
Well, I'm glad you broke that down for us, because it sounds so innocuous and so reasonable, and so, you know, why of course we should act.
It became a trigger phrase for me whenever I saw it in a newspaper. I just had this Pavlovian response, like, no, please.
Well, and another phrase, of course, that we kept hearing throughout the pandemic is follow the science. What do you and the people that you featured in your book think about that phrase and how it was used?
Well, this was something that I had a problem with from literally day one, because I remember the day that the lockdowns were discussed in Canada, and it was literally the first day I thought, wait a minute, you know, on the news, everyone was saying we have to listen to the scientists, the experts. I thought, wait a minute, this is not just a scientific problem. It's a social problem, a psychological problem, you know, an ethical problem, a human problem. It makes no sense just to listen to scientists. It makes absolutely no sense. It's as though you were designing a curriculum for a school and you only listen to the geography teachers. It makes absolutely no sense. You know, we needed to have at the discussion table, you know, the economists, the history professors, the mental health experts, and of course the ethicists, the psychologists. And where were they? Yeah, they were nowhere to be found. And again, this was that team A mentality that all these things can wait. We just have to focus on this virus. And
Right.
it doesn't work for humans.
It doesn't. In fact, one of our senior scholars at the Atlas Society on our faculty, Professor Richard Salzman, professor of political economy at Duke, wrote an article that I thought was really important called, yes, follow the science in every field, right?
Yes, exactly. If you're going to follow the science, that's right. That's right. That's exactly it.
Because we know a few things about economic science and social science and political science. We have to take all of those into account.
Yeah.
So
some people get very offended at the idea of cost benefit. You know, they just immediately their minds immediately go to, well, no, when it comes to lives, we cannot talk about cost benefit. But I know in a kind of critical article I remember reading by Daniel Hanan in the Telegraph, I think, or maybe the Spectator in the UK, saying the only thing worse the only thing worse than putting a value on human life is not doing so. That you have to look costs and benefits in the eye if you're an adult. Saying things like, if it saves one life, it's all worth it. That's a child's rationale. Of course, we want to protect people. We want to save lives. We want to save our loved ones and ourselves. But we have to look at costs and benefits in the eye as adults. And I think that's some of what we objected to, those on Team B, that this sort of childish refusal to manage this as adults.
Well, and you talked about people that get triggered and offended by any notion of a cost benefit analysis. I get triggered by them because if you myopically just focus on we're going to eliminate any COVID deaths or COVID infections without looking at as well at what other deaths are you causing, not just the deaths of despair, deaths of addiction, deaths of delayed medical care, but the fact that reducing people's economic opportunities has, again, in economic science and political science, been showed to reduce their lifespan. It should have been pretty clear that if we lock down India and Pakistan and all of these other countries, that you were going to have mass starvation, and you were going to have a return of a lot of really horrible things, that you were going to see a return of a lot of diseases which had previously been wiped out, and that was going to result in deaths as well. So which is why, when I hear these calls for pandemic amnesty, I'm sure you've seen them as well, that call in the Atlantic. My take has always been that there needs to be an acknowledgement of mistakes and accountability first. Have you seen any signs of either, whether from institutions or individuals who most vociferously pressed for things like lockdowns and mandates?
I would say from some individuals, yes, but not really from mainstream institutions. I think that they kind of give lip service to the idea that, oh yes, we did a few things wrong, we should have, maybe communicated, I don't know, the science of masks or something earlier, but it's never really in favor of really questioning the paradigm that gave rise to everything. So no, I haven't really.
The most troubling, right?
Yeah, I haven't. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen too much evidence at the institutional level of self-reflection and really questioning that model. Maybe certain features. Yeah, we can tweak this, we can tweak that, but actually reflecting on the model, putting a critical gaze on it. I haven't seen much of that. No.
Yeah, and I think that even when institutions or individuals kind of stop with the first story and begin moderating their views, when there isn't sort of a acknowledgement of I was wrong, I learned something, I made some mistakes. If I hear that from people, I have so much more respect for them. I feel like I can trust them. Whether it's in an issue like this, where we're talking about public policy, or in our own personal relationships, if there isn't an acknowledgement of, yeah, this happened, I had this view, I was wrong.
But I don't consider it entirely a matter of right and wrong. I know a lot of people in Team B do. They say, well, we were right and they were wrong. I don't see it quite in that way. I think that there are some aspects of this that depend on the data, and then some aspects that do not depend on the data, that are data independent. They are more a question of worldview. I think if you want one kind of world, you're going to support a certain kind of policy, and if you want another kind of world, you're going to support a different kind of policy. And I don't know if I can honestly say that my worldview is better. It certainly feels
I
better for
can.
me.
I can. I don't have any hesitation about saying that. I mean, I'm thinking, not so much in terms of, well, I prefer a more totalitarian society with, social credit scores and
Right.
keeping track of people, and you prefer a laissez-faire society. And so those are value questions. I'm just basically talking about, I think we all agree that we want to protect children and that they should prioritize their, avoiding loss of learning. We should prioritize minimizing child abuse. We should prioritize minimizing youth suicide. We should prioritize having, avoiding needless economic destruction. So, I mean, from that point of view, I would say, yeah, we could probably at this point say there was a right and a wrong way to go about pursuing those priorities.
Yeah, I'm mostly agree with that, but I know I've talked to people on the other side who say, well, by protecting the children's parents, we are protecting the children because then they are less likely to lose their parents or whatever. Those arguments are a little murkier, and some of them depend on the assessment of the lethality of this virus and the high risk groups, and that was a sort of a whole can of worms in itself.
But
because I
which
think
should be pretty settled now, don't you think?
yeah, no, the messaging was very skewed on that, and I do certainly allude to that in the book, how the messaging really conveyed, oh, well, everyone is at risk, and that was misleading. And they did surveys on people's perceptions of risk, and they were extremely skewed. There was a lot of orders of magnitude of overestimation of the risk.
And that was interesting. You break that down in the book in terms of how that differed by country, how that differed by,
political affiliation. Yeah.
Too. I know Bill Maher has called that out as well. So good on him.
He's one of the people I feature, and he was just this voice, such a sensible voice.
Another voice from the left, but it should be said.
Yes. Yeah, he's another. I mean, I think if I actually catalog the political affiliations of people in the book, there's as many who come from the left as from the right.
And I think that's very, very important. Particularly, I can think of a few friends and family members on the left, and if maybe they would be able to reevaluate some of their positions, hearing the stories of those that are their ideological compatriots. So
that was part of my objective in writing the book. I wasn't just writing it for people who believed what I believe, to preach to the choir. I really do hope to reach some people and at least show them, this is, these are the issues that some of us really struggled with.
Mom, Dad, are you listening?
Actually, or cousin. I was recently in New York to celebrate the 95th birthday of one of my uncles, and I have a lot of family in the States around New York and New Jersey, and a lot of them, especially the younger generation, but even my generation, very, very far left. And so I sort of brought up that I had written this book about COVID. I hadn't really talked to anyone in my family except my immediate family about it. But because the book was, I think it had just been published at that point, like the day before. So I said, oh yeah, I've got this book out and all that. And I, sort of gingerly expressed that, yeah, despite being vaxxed myself and so forth, I've had serious concerns about the lockdowns and mandates and all that stuff. And then one of my cousins piped up, but surely you didn't support the convoy, as though, of course you didn't. And so then I just decided to be honest. And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did support the convoy. And in fact, my son attended the protests in Ottawa with his friends. So, sometimes you just have to, I find, take that chance.
You have to kind of, I think out of all of fear is contagious, but courage is contagious as well. And I think you'll actually sometimes get some respect when you say, yeah, actually, that's what
That's
I
right.
believe
Yeah.
and that's what I support. So
This is how I feel. I think in this case, I think he was just so baffled, like it just was not within his sphere of experience that
yeah,
anyone could, he didn't know anyone who could possibly support the convoy. So he wasn't rude or anything. It was just, okay, let's change the subject now.
well,
But I think
I think it is good because, as in objectivism, and Ayn Rand always, said, if you need to check your premises, right? So if your premises are that anyone who supported the convoy or what have you, that the convoy supporters are stupid or they're heartless or they're, crazy or whatever. And then they're like, oh, but my aunt isn't, I think, any of those things. So
there you go. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yes.
maybe my aunt really is stupid, crazy, and, sadistic. Or maybe I have a wrong preconception about the kinds of people that were supporting those protests.
Yeah.
So
No, and it's true. And you do have to sometimes just take the chance. And I find the older I get, the easier it is. There's less
and when we send you your Ayn Rand refresher package,
oh yeah,
you're going to be totally liberate.
Yeah,
All
no,
right,
that's great. I look forward to spreading the word. But I did the same thing with some of my clients. I'm a freelance medical writer and I have a lot of clients. And some of my long-standing clients, I did come clean to them about how I was feeling about all this, and including that I was writing the book. And I have been pleasantly surprised. Some of them have even bought the book. Some who have very different views about the pandemic than I do, and I haven't lost any of them. So
wow, that is wonderful. All right, in the less than 15 minutes, 12 minutes we have left, I'm going to dive into a few of these wonderful questions that have been waiting from Instagram. Ellen Roth, she recalls that the Canadian government shut down places of worship during the lockdowns and arrested people who tried to minister or practice. Were those people ever given justice? Any idea of their status now?
Yeah, I think some of those cases are still going through the courts. That was a very interesting area because, again, here we get into just the murkier ethical, philosophical dimensions of all this. I'm not religious myself, but I think that the pandemic helped me understand the religious perspective better than ever before in my life. Because, again, reading about what religious communion meant to some people just made me realize, you can't just arbitrarily decide this is non-essential and shut it down. Whereas, perusing the aisles of Walmart in search of, some kind of cleaner, that's essential.
Or the liquor store, right?
Or the liquor store.
Pot dispensary.
Yeah, and those are certainly
club,
plentiful here in Toronto. I don't know if you've been to Toronto lately, but there's a weed store at every street corner. Which I
not a fan.
I don't have a problem with, but it's yeah. I read about also the Orthodox Jewish communities in New York and in Israel who protested all this. And, I have some Orthodox Judaism in my background, but I never really, identified with that group, but I understood them better than ever before, which was a very interesting development.
Well, it is also very apropos, given this is the first night of Passover, and I myself experienced some change. I'm not particularly religious, but I do enjoy certain aspects of religious tradition and community. And I had belonged to the Malibu Jewish community synagogue here, and I actually left them and joined the Chabad because, as
really,
said,
wow,
yes, not because I'm gonna, start changing, my dress or covering my hair or anything like that, but just because they were not like, show us your papers.
Yeah.
And it's just, they were just, again, I think if your commitment as a member of the Chabad community is that you're getting married to have children, to repopulate all of the lives lost in the Holocaust, and you have 12 kids, you probably have a different attitude towards infections and germs and life.
Yeah.
And
in fact, one person
who they place on the children, on the young people, that less willing to put so much of the burden of these policies on that age group.
Yeah, for sure. And I remember one person that I quote, I think, who was quoted in an article, an Israeli religious person said that in our community, we believe that the Torah protects children and school protects children. So we want them to keep going to school. And, that was a very fresh perspective. Which I respected.
All right. Let's see. Gene Gersh on Twitter. Hey, Gene. He says many doctors in the U.S. were silenced for daring to propose alternative methods of treatment for their patients. I know we've had Houman Hamadi on this show, and he's been a crusader against medical censorship. So Gene's asking, was the same true for Canada? And what does this have to say for a patient's right to choose?
Yeah, I think it was the same across the board, the early treatments. I don't get into that too much into the book because I consider that sort of a separate line of inquiry that really is, is more about the data than my book is. Which is more about the sociology of the whole thing. But yes, having said that, I think this suppression of alternative treatments was part of a larger pattern of suppression of any position that ran counter to the dominant paradigm. We lock down, we have the restrictions, and then we get the vaccines and we can gradually loosen up. And so, yes, it was very counterproductive and harmful.
Yeah, and I think it also harms just the trust that doctors and patients need for effective treatment. So there was, as we're running towards the top of the hour now, we talked before about accountability, about a reckoning. And you had this really interesting passage in the book. You talked about imagining such a reckoning with politicians and public health officials fielding questions from plaintiffs who were traumatized by their policies. The Vietnamese nail salon owner who lost her business, or the parent whose children fell behind or worse. So tell us a little bit about what that scenario looked like. What might some of those questions be, and how would it resolve itself?
Yeah, it's my fantasy scenario. Where all us side B people are in a courtroom, and we're able to bear witness to what it was like and to explain why these policies were so traumatizing. I think I might start by asking them, why did you choose to stoke fear rather than allay it? Because really it's right there in all pandemic policy manuals. The function of government and leaders is to keep the population calm. Why did you choose the exact opposite route in this case? And then I would also ask what we just talked about earlier, why did you suppress dissent? Why did you have no tolerance for different approaches? And why were you not receptive or interested in any kind of public debate about all this? This is not how a liberal democracy is supposed to function. Again, for a couple of weeks, maybe, okay, invoke the precautionary principle. I'm kind of viscerally against the whole idea of lockdowns, but I will allow, okay, when there's a really extreme situation or you think it's extreme, for a very limited period, you can exert some kind of authority. But after that, if you are a liberal democracy, you have to pull back and consider the bigger picture. So why did you not do that? And why did people who tried to do that get silenced and shamed and snitched on and the whole thing? And then I would also ask them why they were so obsessed, with these minute details of people's lives, that they just lost sight of the big picture. What's the whole point of saving lives if we're not going to save living, if we're going to lose living in the process? Why did they behave so cruelly and inhumanely toward children, making them kneel in one school in, Anchorage, I believe it was, so they wouldn't touch their desks or touch each other, sending people who they thought were exposed to COVID outside in the cold in some cold cities. There were some deaths of young people that resulted from them not receiving care in the hospital because they had been exposed to COVID. I mean, these completely disproportionate and insane, this attachment to the narrative that extinguished just their basic humane impulses. So I would ask them that. And then, of course, there's the one that really troubles a lot of people is, why did they let people die alone? A lot of survivors find it very traumatizing that they were not able to say goodbye to their loved ones. There are ways to increase safety while letting people say goodbye to dying people. Again, it was so much, the letter of the law instead of the spirit. They just lost sight of their humanity.
All right, quick answer to this, because we have just about 2 minutes left. What is your response to people who say, enough already, sure, mistakes were made, can't we just stop talking about this and move on?
Oh my God, no. We cannot. No, we can't. I think there's enough material for many, more pandemic books and articles of different kinds. No, I think it's so important that we keep talking about it so it doesn't happen again. That is because right now, I don't think many of us have any kind of assurance that it's not going to happen again. Because, lockdown has now entered the toolbox of pandemic strategies, lockdown and all the associated measures, the mandates and that whole paradigm. So if we don't talk about it and tease it apart and find out and discuss what was wrong with it, we're completely vulnerable to having the exact same thing happen again.
Agreed. And I think that is why we can't sweep it under the rug, why we do need to press for reconciliation and for accountability and for a new or maybe an old consensus of what to do.
Exactly. And that's one thing the Brownstone Institute is very good at. I think that's part of their vision, just to get that accountability.
And we'll put the link in there to our friends at the Brownstone Institute. Amazing work. Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you for this wonderful book. I encourage everyone to go out and get a copy. Hopefully coming to audio soon. Are you working on an Audible version?
Yes, I believe the Brownstone is. Yeah.
Good. And I want to thank all of you who joined us today. Thank you for your wonderful questions. If you enjoyed this video, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at atlassociety.org. Any new donations of any size will be matched by our trustees. So go ahead, support the work that we do, and if it is providing value to you. And also, please be sure to tune in next week when journalist Joshua Mitchell will be our guest on the Atlas Society Asks to talk about his book, The Debt Trap: How Student Loans Became a National Catastrophe. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you very much.